Just thought I would do a reading from the Majjhima Nikāya, one of the classics. It's an excerpt from one of Ajahn Ñāṇiko's favorite suttas, and it's also one of my favorite suttas, the Chunky Sutta, Majjhima Nikāya 95. And I thought it was just pertinent because I hear a lot of talk going around about, what's happening in the world, and just like sometimes it can seem very certain that we know what's happening, and it talks about preservation of truth and how to be careful about investigating truth, and so I just thought I would read a few passages from this. So it's the Buddha. He's talking to a young Brahmin named Kapatika, and his clan name is Bharadvaja. There are these 5 things, Bharadvaja, which may turn out in 2 different ways here and now. What 5? Faith, approval, oral tradition, reasoned cognition, and reflective acceptance of a view. These 5 things may turn out in 2 different ways here and now. Now something may be fully accepted out of faith, yet it may be empty, hollow, and false, but something else may not be fully accepted out of faith, yet it may be factual, true, and unmistaken. Again, something may be fully approved of, may be well cogitated, may be well reflected upon, yet it may be empty, hollow, and false. But something else may not be well reflected upon, yet it may be factual, true, and unmistaken. Under these conditions, it is not proper for a wise man who preserves truth to come to the definite conclusion, only this is true, anything else is wrong. But, Master Gotama, in what way is there the preservation of truth? How does one preserve truth? We ask Master Gotama about the preservation of truth. If a person has faith, Bharadvaja, he preserves truth when he says, "My faith is thus," but he does not yet come to the definite conclusion, only this is true, anything else is wrong. In this way, Bharadvaja, there is the preservation of truth. In this way he preserves truth. In this way we describe the preservation of truth. But as yet there is no discovery of truth. If a person approves of something, Bharadvaja, he preserves truth when he says, "I approve of something," but does not yet come to the definite conclusion, only this is true, anything else is wrong. If he receives an oral tradition, he preserves truth when he says, "My oral tradition is thus," but he does not yet come to the definite conclusion, only this is true, anything else is wrong. If he reaches a conclusion based on reasoned cogitation, he preserves truth when he says, "I have reached a conclusion based on reasoned cogitation." If he gains reflective acceptance of a view, he preserves truth when he says, "My reflective acceptance of a view is thus," but he does not yet come to the definite conclusion, only this is true, anything else is wrong. In this way, too, Bharadvaja, there is the preservation of truth. In this way he preserves truth. In this way we describe the preservation of truth. But as yet there is no discovery of truth. In that way, Master Gotama, there is the preservation of truth. In that way one preserves truth. In that way we recognize the preservation of truth. But in what way, Master Gotama, is there the discovery of truth? In what way does one discover truth? We ask Master Gotama about the discovery of truth. Here, Bharadvaja, a bhikkhu may be living in dependence on some village or town. Then a householder or a householder's son goes to him and investigates him in regard to 3 kinds of states: in regard to states based on greed, in regard to states based on hate, and in regard to states based on delusion. Are there in this Venerable One any states based on greed, such that, with his mind obsessed by those states, while not knowing he might say, "I know," or while not seeing he might say, "I see," or he might urge others to act in a way that would lead to their harm and suffering for a long time? As he investigates him, he comes to know there are no such states based on greed in this Venerable One. The bodily behavior and the verbal behavior of this Venerable One are not those of one affected by greed. And the Dhamma that this Venerable One teaches is profound, hard to see and hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle, to be experienced by the wise, This Dhamma cannot easily be taught by one affected by greed. When he has investigated him and has seen that he is purified from states based on greed, he next investigates him in the same way on states based on hate, on states based on delusion. This Dhamma cannot easily be taught by one affected by delusion. When he has investigated him and has seen that he is purified from states based on delusion, then he places faith in him. Filled with faith, he visits him and pays respects to him. Having paid respects to him, he gives ear. When he gives ear, he hears the Dhamma. Having heard the Dhamma, he memorizes it and examines the meaning of the teachings he has memorized. When he examines their meaning, he gains a reflective acceptance of those teachings. When he has gained a reflective acceptance of those teachings, zeal springs up. When zeal has sprung up, he applies his will. Having applied will, he scrutinizes. Having scrutinized, he strives. Resolutely striving, he realizes with the body the ultimate truth and sees it by penetrating with wisdom. In this way, Bharadvaja, there is the discovery of truth. In this way one discovers truth. In this way we describe the discovery of truth. But as yet there is no final arrival at truth. In that way, Master Gotama, there is the discovery of truth. In that way one discovers truth. In that way we recognize the discovery of truth. But in what way, Master Gotama, is there final arrival at truth? In what way does one finally arrive at truth? We ask Master Gotama about the final arrival at truth. The final arrival at truth, Bharadvaja, lies in the repetition, development, and cultivation of those same things. In this way, Bharadvaja, there is the final arrival at truth. In this way one finally arrives at truth. In this way we describe the final arrival at truth. In that way, Master Gotama, there is the final arrival at truth. In that way one finally arrives at truth. In that way we recognize the final arrival at truth. But what, Master Gotama, is most helpful for the final arrival at truth? We ask Master Gotama about the thing most helpful for the final arrival at truth. Striving is the most helpful for the final arrival at truth, Bharadvaja. If one does not strive, one will not finally arrive at truth. But because one strives, one does finally arrive at truth. That is why striving is most helpful for the final arrival at truth. But what, Master Gotama, is most helpful for striving? Scrutiny is most helpful for striving, Bharadvaja. If one does not scrutinize, one will not strive. But because one scrutinizes, one strives. That is why scrutiny is most helpful for striving. But what, Master Gotama, is most helpful for scrutiny? Application of the will is most helpful for scrutiny, Bharadvaja. If one does not apply one's will, one will not scrutinize. But because one applies one's will, one scrutinizes. That is why application of the will is most helpful for scrutiny. But what, Master Gotama, is most helpful for application of the will? Zeal is most helpful for the application of will, Bharadvaja. If one does not arouse zeal, one will not apply one's will. But because one arouses zeal, one applies one's will. That is why zeal is most helpful for application of the will. But what, Master Gotama, is most helpful for zeal? A reflective acceptance of the teachings is most helpful for zeal, Bharadvaja. If one does not gain a reflective acceptance of the teachings, zeal will not spring up. But because one gains a reflective acceptance of the teachings, zeal springs up. That is why a reflective acceptance of the teachings is most helpful for zeal. But what, Master Gotama, is most helpful for a reflective acceptance of the teachings? Examination of the meaning is most helpful for a reflective acceptance of the teachings, Bharadvaja. If one does not examine their meaning, one will not gain a reflective acceptance of the teachings. But because one examines their meaning, one gains a reflective acceptance of the teachings. That is why examination of the meaning is most helpful for a reflective acceptance of the teachings. But what, Master Gotama, is most helpful for examination of the meaning? We ask Master Gotama about the thing most helpful for examination of the meaning. Memorizing the teachings is most helpful for examining the meaning. If one does not memorize a teaching, one will not examine its meaning. but because one memorizes a teaching, one examines its meaning. But what Master Gotama is most helpful for memorizing the teachings? Hearing the Dhamma is most helpful for memorizing the teachings. If one does not hear the Dhamma, one will not memorize the teachings. But because one hears the Dhamma, one memorizes the teachings. That is why hearing the Dhamma is most helpful for memorizing the teachings. But what, Master Gotama, is most helpful for hearing the Dhamma? Giving ear is most helpful for hearing the Dhamma, Bharadvaja. If one does not give ear, one will not hear the Dhamma. But because one gives ear, one hears the Dhamma. That is why giving ear is most helpful for hearing the Dhamma. But what, Master Gotama, is most helpful for giving ear? Paying respects is most helpful for giving ear, Bharadvaja. If one does not pay respects, one will not give ear, but because one pays respect, one gives ear. That is why paying respect is most helpful for giving ear. But what, Master Gotama, is most helpful for paying respect? Visiting is most helpful for paying respect, Bharadvaja. If one does not visit a teacher, one will not pay respect to him. But because one visits a teacher, one pays respect to him. That is why visiting is most helpful for paying respect. But what, Master Gotama, is most helpful for visiting? Faith is most helpful for visiting, Bharadvaja. If faith does not arise, one will not visit a teacher. But because faith arises, one visits a teacher. That is why faith is most helpful for visiting. Okay, I believe that is a reflection of this morning.